Anishinang Gaamiinigooyang Chiganoninaan Manito Hatsukana Gaye Wapanong Shawanong Ningabi Kiwetinong Kimama Nan Gaye Miigwech Nindina Miigwech Gaye Nindinag Kagipimatasio Atmeusha Witokawushinam Minik Kenibimatasiang.
This story is Gaamiinigooyang, or That Which Is Given to Us, about economic survival. Binesikwe Nindijinikaz Makwa Indo Dam. Winona LaDuke from the White Earth Reservation.
The animals and the plants, all of creation as we know it, all of the environment as we know it, existed for many years before man came, if you will, into the picture. And a time came when the animals and the plants decided to take pity on man, because man was so pitiful, and called him into this great circle and said, in effect, that we know that you will need sustenance to keep you alive, and we will provide this for you. You can use our skin, you can use our flesh, you can use our bones for your livelihood. But we ask of you that you remember us in ceremony. You remember us with those sacred fires. You offer the sema, and you do each time you take or you use our bodies, that you offer back to us this ceremony. So that which is given to us, I think, is everything.
Each living thing was put on this earth for a certain reason. We were put here for a certain reason. The deer were here for a certain reason, to provide us sustenance. Fish were there, the berries, the nuts that we used to gather. Each living thing has a purpose in life. And that's what I believe in. That's what a lot of the Anishinaabe believe in.
These animals and the plants and everything else, these spirits feed our spirits as Anishinaabe people. They make us who we are. You know, if we don't have the fish, if we don't have the deer, if we don't have the plants to feed us spiritually, we're no longer Anishinaabe. You know, we need to utilize these gifts in our ceremonies and our feasts and our everyday lives, because it's who we are.
Abiting is and marriage a kibipong, Paco is Kishinikaz on Shinabe. Winge ito ukikwenui michinawa. Bimuseba nisan ima chike Ojibwe sage kaning. Eshiwaba mati nisan mikwamin, kaish bishininet. Ukikakenda nat sokana ima hayanet. Kiwete nung nake undanimot. Takana minoj sema kapakichike. Minawa nakamon inendam pakawis. Ukinunda ko at sokana. Pisani kum mushkinaton. Kimashkimot kun minawatash mikwam. Aniki iwanitash kego wabanapiken. Pama pake chiwebinan mashkimot. Anikupaki wevin. Pama ka kisheb kikabayan dawabandan mashkimot. Kikong kimata piwag. Ano chiko ki inetamani kiwed. Kimote ina. No tina nitok kagi inetawat. Pitiko kaye kiwe bashinet. Ukipisin dawa at sokana. Mitash ka Gaamiinigooyang kikongwa.
And in this story, this young man understands that in order to receive something, you have to give something. And so Semach was given. As long as you kept a connection with the spirit world, as long as you followed those original teachings, life was going to be okay for you.
We were taught that man is sort of last in the order of creation and really depends upon the preceding orders to live. And none of the preceding orders, whether they be plants, animals, fish, bacteria, the earth itself, the sky, the air, the water, none of those things depend upon man for their survival, but man depends upon each of them for his. And so in that way, Chippewa people, Ojibwe people, Anishinaabe people saw themselves as pitiful, as really the weakest in that web of life.
There are three assumptions that kind of explain their values, beliefs, and practices. And one of those assumptions is that the individual is dependent upon the group for survival. And the second one is that the group is dependent upon nature for survival. And the third is nature is dependent upon the supernatural for survival. So they saw themselves as tied into a system.
Gizi gwaninik ski kamisikeo Anishinaabe. Gini bininik wiwaskewag ni iwe Joshitowa chimanan makakon chapakwewa kaye huigiwa miwan. Kita kwa gininik kaye manominikewag upasanawa ukapisanawa upaushkanawa unoskachinawa manomen mitashi iwe michiwat kababy pong. Kita kwa gininik kaye kiusewag ando shibewag.
And when the Creator, placed us here on the earth, Anishinaabe King, Creator said, this is how you could live good. Everything that the Anishinaabe need is here in this ecosystem. We are totally blessed with the wealth of this.
In fact, we did have a very sophisticated economy, a reciprocal economy, and in the production of goods, whether it was at the time fur or wood product or rice or other medicinals, they produced what basically they needed, and if there was something that was needed that wasn't readily available in the environment, they produced extra of what was in order to trade.
In the early 1600s, French explorers first made contact with Ojibwe villages in present-day Michigan. They brought with them metal goods, gunpowder, cloth, and an economy based on the fur trade. Our ancestors at first welcomed the French and soon adapted the new tools, methods, and trade goods to their lifestyle.
I think the Anishinaabe people are just like other human beings. If you can make the life easier for your child or your wife or your grandmother, you'll do it. And all these items that were bought in by the Europeans made life easier. And adaptability is a trait of humans. Over the long term, it might be detrimental, but in the short term, it's accepted.
It involved them in a very intensive kind of trade pattern, which changed in many aspects of their life. They began to use European weaponry. They didn't manufacture the guns that they used, so they became dependent upon the Europeans for those weapons. They became dependent upon the Europeans for the ammunition for those weapons. And so with the trade came an increasing dependency on the European.
What you have, I think, entering into kind of this sustainable society is a concept of capitalism, essentially, that enticed people to go after things that they may not need. And it's, I think, a real difference between a tribal society and a capitalistic society, and this is accumulation of material wealth. With the fur trade, you have now the idea that you introduce things to a society that people might want or like, and then you get them to harvest more than they really need so that they can acquire these things they may want.
Getting the Indians in debt became an important vehicle for keeping control over them, and so the Europeans and later the United States government sought to make sure that in trading with the tribes, the bands, that they did so at a disadvantage to the tribes, that they inflated the prices of their goods so that the tribes increasingly found it more difficult to obtain those goods, would have to more intensively hunt, bring in more animal pelts, beaver skins or whatever to pay for the goods they wanted, and to force them into debt.
As the fur trade expanded, trading posts soon played a central role in our communities. These posts became the location of the seasonal rendezvous, where the French, British, and later the Americans socialized and traded.
Increasingly, it turned them into people who intensively hunted. They began killing off the animal life in particular regions. They began expanding farther and farther away, really moving away from a very mixed kind of an economy in which handicraft and skill and artisanship was a very important part of that, into something which was dependent upon the European for manufactured goods. And what's hard sometimes to realize is this dependency relationship actually brought them into a worldwide economy. The European traders were trading with the Indians for goods, which they in turn traded, which made their way not only to the various colonial settlements in the New World, but made their way to Europe.
We started to get commercialized. We started, our economy changed, you know, from dependence on each other to dependence on other people. When you have a community that's dependent on each other to protect each other, and you know that it stays strong. But then when you got outside influences and certain individuals start depending on those, it starts breaking up a community, and I guess your traditions and other values that you hold dear are slowly disintegrate.
By the 1830s, the trapping of beaver became less important, since European fashions had changed. This caused the demand for furs to disappear. Our dependence on this trade severely changed our ability to survive in traditional ways. The collapse of the fur trade economy was a disaster for our people.
When the headmen arrived at Fort Snelling in '37, and when they arrived at Fort LaPointe in 1842, the headmen were desperate. They were watching their villagers die. Families were starving.
It is hard to give up the land. It will remain and cannot be destroyed. But you may cut down the trees and others will grow up. You know we cannot live deprived of lakes and rivers. There is some game on the land yet, and for that we wish to remain upon it. Sometimes we scrape the trees and eat the bark. The Great Spirit above made the earth and causes it to produce that which enables us to live. We will wait to hear what you offer for the lands. Flatmouth.
There's a trilogy of treaties that are really important to Chippewas in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, and that would be the 1837, 1842, and 1854 treaty. The 37 and 42 treaties were unique in that land was sold to the United States, but the Chippewas remained on the land, and that was the guarantee that they bargained for, was that they would be able to remain on the land and be able to get a living from the land.
Americans were very interested in dealing with them in ways that allowed them to have continued access to that land. Non-Indians weren't interested in other things. They were not interested in the settlement on those lands.
The United States government received a tremendous amount of land. They received the minerals, they received the timber. What the Ojibwe received was very, very little.
They received a promise of dollars. That promise was not well kept on the part of the United States. They received some meager goods that were spelled out in the treaty, and some services that were spelled out in the treaty. The most important thing that came to the Ojibwe people as a result of those treaties were retaining the rights to hunt, to fish, and gather, a right which they had, of course, before the treaties were ever signed.
You tell us that the Great Spirit placed us on this earth to be friends and equals. Your red brothers believed you and have yielded up to you their lands. To them, the consequences are poverty, suffering, and starvation. Many of our people will not see the budding of the leaves of another spring. Though we have sold the greatest portion of our lands, we have gained nothing by it. We are poorer than ever. The more treaties we make, the more miserable we become.
The negotiation in 1854 called for the creation of reservations in the Great Lakes region for the Ojibwe people. There was also the recognition of the right for them to have a permanent presence, a homeland, in areas that were traditionally areas in which they lived.
Now confined to a limited land base, we found it difficult to continue our traditional seasonal activities. The season round required moving from one area to another area so that we would not overharvest the resources in any one place.
Well, in Lac du Flambeau, our people found it necessary, absolutely critical, to leave the reservation to hunt deer because they just weren't available on the reservation. And so, as they did this, a new form of government was in place by the state of Wisconsin, this conservation department. And they began to view this as an infringement on state rights, if you will.
These fish and game laws made it more and more difficult for our people to survive with a subsistence lifestyle. Expanding timber and mining industries in the Great Lakes made it even more difficult to maintain our subsistence lifestyle.
We have belonging to this reserve 714 Indians. Many of the men are found at Ashland and other white settlements, employed in the mills, sash and door factories, copper blacksmith and carpenter shops, or earning their daily bread at other kinds of educated labor.
By the late 1800s, the American West was officially settled. The country's east-west boundary finally reached from sea to shining sea. And economic development characterized the mood of the nation.
The federal government pushed a policy called allotment, the effort to break up Indian reservations and to allot the land into private acreages, which could be owned by individual Indians.
Of course, the Indian agents wanted the Ojibwe to make the transition from wandering hunters and fishers to successful farmers.
What was discovered was the land was not very good. It was not well suited for agricultural kinds of activities. The land was not the kind of land that allowed the Indians to make a living according to white standards and styles, and this was the whole pressure that was being exerted on them at this time was to become more and more like white people, to be educated like whites, to take on the attributes of whites. but yet the reservations they found themselves on could not support that kind of a lifestyle.
Land speculators, timber barons, traders, and settlers quickly moved onto allotted reservations. They acquired our land through a series of government-sanctioned homestead acts, as well as through fraud and outright theft.
We now have only the pine lands of our reservations for our future subsistence and support, but the manner in which we are being defrauded of these has alarmed us.
By 1888, all of the timber had been completely cut off of the Coterie tribe. It took a matter of about 15 years to completely denude the tribe of probably 8 million board feet of prime timber, the only thing that was left in northern Wisconsin at the time. Tragic consequences. People were starving to death, and yet there were millions of dollars that were being exchanged in the process and lost to the Indians. The reservation looked like a war-torn battlefield.
By combining elements of the American economy, such as wage labor, with our traditional seasonal lifestyle, we managed to survive in a growing atmosphere of paternalism and racism.
I think Chippewas continued to hunt, fish, trap, and gather. The states began to exercise and pass regulations regarding hunting and fishing and trapping, and generally tried to make those apply to Indians. And in some cases they did. They did make them apply. In fact, exercising your treaty rights was called violating, simply because you had to violate state laws in order to exercise a federal treaty right.
In 1901, John Blackbird from Bad River was arrested and imprisoned for gillnet fishing. In 1907, an Ojibwe named Morin from Bayfield, Wisconsin, was found guilty of fishing on Lake Superior. This constant pressure to break our connection to the land caused poverty and the commercialization of our precious traditional culture.
There's an interesting relationship that develops between the Indian community and the beginning of the tourism industry in northern Minnesota. And even by, say, 1909 and 10, there were a large number of brochures and companies promoting tourism. So that as a kind of a way to make a living, some of them began selling tourism items to travelers in the area. They also become fishing guides and hunting guides. So the opportunities to survive were there.
World War I brought many Ojibwe into the armed services and increased the pressure to farm for those who stayed at home.
Ogichida, the warriors, came back and found the reservations, found the families totally impoverished, no work, totally a depressing time.
In 1928, the Merriam Report blasted the federal policy of allotment and called for support of Indian communities, protection of property rights, and new initiatives for economic development.
Depression haunted America.
The Great Depression led to a new era of economic and social reform in the 1930s. Soon, President Roosevelt's New Deal reached our Ojibwe communities. The Indian Division of the Civilian Conservation Corps was established in 1934 and provided minimum wage jobs for many Ojibwe. It also developed some reservation resources.
And the Indian enrollees do a fine job in clearing operations and in the construction of trails and roads. Few of these boys were familiar with heavy machinery, but practical training on the job has developed handling skill.
The Commissioner of Indian Affairs under Roosevelt was John Collier. He was a supporter of traditional culture and was instrumental in passing the landmark 1934 Wheeler-Howard Act, also known as the Indian Reorganization Act, or IRA.
The sum of $10 million shall be established as a revolving fund from which the Secretary of the Interior may make loans to Indian chartered corporations for the purpose of promoting the economic development of such tribes and their members. Wheeler-Howard Act.
While these programs attempted to build up local economies, our people still had to rely on traditional ways of seasonal survival.
Growing up, when I was about 5 years old, I went to live with my grandparents. And they followed the seasons. In the winter, we went to Glen, where we tapped maple trees and made maple sugar and syrup. In the summer, we went to the old Highway 169 and had a basket stand. In the fall, we went to the rice camps and went ricing. But during that time, they taught you everything, you know. Everything was in Ojibwe. And they didn't actually sit you down and tell you a story. You picked it up while they worked.
I was born and raised on the Mille Lacs Reservation. I have very fond memories of my childhood, maple sugaring, wild ricing, picking berries. I had 8 brothers and sisters and lived on a tar paper shack that we had no running water, no electricity. I guess my parents provided for us in whichever way they could.
My dad was a great storyteller. He could tell stories that his grandfather told him. And as a result of that, you could appreciate how they lived on the island. Basically, when they went hunting, they didn't take a gun. They found a ravine, and they made stuck some sticks in the ground and made like a little area that actually would funnel the rabbits in, and somebody would be on the end, and they'd chase the rabbits down, and when the rabbits would go in a little funnel, they'd clunk them on the head. That's how they went rabbit hunting back then, because they didn't have the shells, very poor.
During World War II, hundreds of Ojibwe men fought overseas. On the home front, the wartime economy provided jobs in the cities, pulling our people away from the reservations.
We were living in Superior at the time. My mother and dad were working for the shipyard. They were both welders. During World War II, we couldn't go and buy groceries like we do today. And I can remember my grandmother, and I know this was illegal, but she used to do it. And she would put fish in box and deer meat. And luckily, she never got caught, but she would jump the Greyhound bus and come into Superior and bring us supplies, you know, food and things from home.
Bernard James was an anthropologist from Illinois, a scientist who spent 13 months at Le Coudray, living with the people. He described Pequawang in 1951 and 52. He said the people were destitute and they were poverty-stricken. The average per capita income was $171 a year, while at the same time, the average family per capita income of rural farm families in Wisconsin was $3,281 a year. So you can see that it was a disparate condition of the haves and the have-nots. On our reservation in the 1950s, the Ojibwe Indians were being arrested if they were caught fishing or hunting off the reservation. One time they stopped my car, my old Indian car. The trunk didn't work. And they stopped me and they missed my brother who had the fish in his car. And When they couldn't get the trunk open, they went into the back of my car illegally and took the seat off and pulled off some material off the back of my seat and tried to get into my trunk through the inside of the car, but they couldn't find anything, so they let me go. Lots of tribal members were arrested during that period of time. It was a precarious time. People really depended on deer, to sustain themselves, and hunting was real common. And you could be arrested for no reason.
When I was younger, the government agency on a reservation had brochures telling us how good life is in the city. This was part of the relocation plan to get us off the reservation. Everybody that left usually ended up in the slums or the ghettos.
Relocation was specifically designed to lure Ojibwe off the reservations and into the cities with the promises of jobs, housing, and education.
Relocation, I think, was one of the worst things that could have happened because, again, broken promises. Trying to live on what I think it was $50, $52 a week in a city with 2 kids, rent, groceries, transportation, the whole bit had to come out of that. And there was just no way it could be done. So I remember that, there were a lot of Native American people living in Chicago and the big cities during relocation. And because money was so scarce, everybody would pool things. And I can remember that payday would come along and people would go out and buy groceries and they'd bring them to my house, my apartment, and I would cook. And sometimes there would be 10, 15 people eating at my house.
They gave you $35 a week to live on. And you live in San Francisco, you don't buy nothing with $35. And we complained one day, and I said, this don't go far. Well, you can't have steak every day, they said. I was a structural fitter, see. They took me to Levi Strauss as a fitter. Mr. Oglethorpe, I said, I am not that kind of fitter, I'm a structural fitter. I don't think he was qualified to even be a job counselor.
Relocated Ojibwe families in urban areas continued to cling to our traditions and found ways to maintain the connection with our communities back home.
These people did come back at various times of the year. They'd come back at hunting time. They would come back to do the wild rice harvesting. Some of them even came back for the maple sugar, bringing back with them some of their urban experiences. It was definitely a time of change at Lakota.
I think that, in the 60s, in the early 60s was the civil rights movement and black power and all of that. And I thought that the Indian movement sort of trailed behind that. 1971, you had the takeover of the Winter Dam at Lakota. And I think those kind of national events, big media events, really lifted the tide of understanding and a realization that here are these treaties, here are these rights, and why aren't we exercising them?
The legal battle over treaty rights began in Michigan in 1976 and resulted in the 1981 Fox decision, affirming Ojibwe rights to fish in the ceded waters of the Great Lakes. 2 years later in Wisconsin, the Voigt decision came down in favor of the Lake Superior Ojibwe and affirmed our reserved rights to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded territory.
The DNR themselves said that by the mid-1980s, there was going to have to be a reduction in some of the major bag limits for some of the sports fishing because of increased cabins and basically development. So when the court ruling came down, guess what happened? We were targeted for the reduction of the bag limits and for the failed economic policies, failed environmental policies for northern Wisconsin, and the sports fishing community just exploded.
If you read the newspapers of that time period, it sounded like a lot of fish were being taken by Chippewa spearfishers, and it sounded like a lot of deer were being taken by hunters off the reservation. When you actually look at the numbers that are involved, the numbers of deer that were taken did not even approach the roadkill in the state of Wisconsin.
As sovereign people, we held these inherent rights long before contact with Euro-Americans. We believe there is a fundamental connection between the fulfillment of these rights, our traditional subsistence lifestyle, and the survival of our people.
When they signed those treaties, they were not thinking of themselves. They were thinking of us in the future. That's why they reserved, in all instances, the right to hunt, to fish, and to gather, because without that, you cannot survive. You can become something else, but you can't survive as an Anishinaabe.
You can have cultural sovereignty and cultural integrity, but if you don't have some economic integrity, some economic sovereignty, it can be tough. And you can have political sovereignty and political integrity, but without some means of income that gives the tribal nation, the tribal government, some discretionary power to fund programs that they deem essential, whether it's for educational scholarships or for daycare or for recreational centers or whatever. It's going to be difficult for the tribe to subsist.
One of our first enterprises was the pallet making factory. It was a wood shop, very marginal business. It wasn't a huge success, although it did provide jobs, and we got a pole barn building out of it.
Government money comes and goes and projects get started, and if people don't have experience running them, or if government money goes away, they have a tendency to fail. And so Indian country needed some kind of unusual shot in the arm. The tribes and the tribal attorneys started looking to things that could be regulated by tribes. Now, bingo, for example, it's not criminal in most states to play bingo, and the pot limits are usually limited by state regulations. But the Indian tribes could set their own pot limits, or so they thought. And a whole bunch of cases, this occurred in Florida and other places in the country, and they started playing it in Minnesota, high stakes Indian bingo, as it was sometimes known. And finally, in 1987, the Cabazon case, as it's known, went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the Indians can do it. The act says that Indian gaming would be divided into three classes. Class 1 are traditional games played by tribes, and those would be regulated by the tribes themselves. So the Chippewa moccasin game, for example, would be regulated by Indian tribes. Class 2 gaming is bingo, pull tabs, certain types of card games that are, for the most part, that would be regulated by tribes and the National Indian Gaming Commission. And then Class 3 is everything else. It's games that are legal in the state, and they will be negotiated by a compact between the state and the individual tribes. And so for the first time, there was going to be federally required agreements between states and tribes.
It started in Michigan in 1985 for us, and it gave us the first real opportunity to expand employment and to generate a large amount of income as a part of our community. And it was first just a card parlor. And then we negotiated with the state a final movement on that, the compacts were signed. And we expanded our casino base from just to Sault Ste. Marie to St. Ignace and to Hessel, and then Maca, or Manistee area, as well as the Christmas site.
we started the casino, we employed about 130 people. It really started to jump in about the 1990s where employment increased. Today we're 2,600 employees, work year-round, have multiple businesses, and have large governmental programs.
Fortune Bay today provides over 400 positions for the Boys Fort Band and the area residents. We have employees from 39 different communities who are coming in and working at Fortune Bay. And we're working today with many of the resort associations and chambers of commerce because we feel that a healthy economy is good for not only for the band, but for the people of the area.
If there is anything in the 20th century which has lifted reservations from poverty to being in a position to deal with health, human services, education, all kinds of questions on the reservations, it has been gaming. That is not to say that tribes are unanimously in favor of gaming. Many tribes, among many tribes, there is a split opinion on whether gaming is a good thing or not a good thing.
It's not anybody's favorite form of economic development. It's certainly not my favorite form of how to make money, but tribes needed this shot in the arm, and Congress acknowledged that in 1988, and without $1 of federal money, they basically have rebuilt the infrastructures on a lot of the reservations.
Remember, the reservations were not good land. The reservations were not adequate enough in terms of boundaries for the needs of their people. The reservations did not have many of the kinds of things that were necessary for the Indians to develop an economic life that would allow them to sustain themselves without additional resources coming in. But gaming has provided new opportunities for the tribes. It's also provided new challenges for the tribes as well.
That was probably the turning point in our lives where we started to be self-sufficient. I think if you look around our reservation here, you can see what we've done with our revenues. And that was to build schools, clinics, infrastructure. We've also built homes where a lot of people are now moving back because of the jobs that we've created here. And new community centers, ceremonial buildings. We need to diversify our economy because we can't rely on a single industry anymore. We've built hotels and convention centers at Mille Lacs and Hinckley, and we've purchased banks now in Onamia, and we've got 2 Onamia and Hinckley, along with a bakery, gas station, fast food franchise, and a pizza chain.
We've been real fortunate. The band has created an entrepreneurial program, and that's definitely been an advantage for our individual tribal members who want to become their own shop owners, their own business owners, to be their own boss.
Sometimes I think I'm gonna wake up and see this all been a dream. But in reality, I guess that's where we started, was a dream, and it has a ripple effect across this region here.
Our goal is to have a self-sufficiency fund that we only spend the interest out of it. We don't believe in the per capita payments. If we can take the money we spend today and invest it and still increase some of the services to the membership based on our needs, you'll see the funds grow each and every year thereafter. And if we do that every year, it doesn't matter, 100 years out, those incomes that we've generated and that interest will continue to grow and provide for the needs of the communities.
One thing that everybody seems to think is that all of the tribes are getting per capita distributions from gaming, and that each individual Indian is getting rich from the slot machines on the reservations. And for the most part, that's not true. There are some tribes that give some very small per caps. Very small number give very large per caps. but most of the tribes have avoided that. And they put the money back into the community, which essentially the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act requires that the money go for education and community development, economic development on the reservations.
The introduction of the hospitality gaming industry on reservation for the first time in the history of the United States and tribes, it caused an emancipation of people's minds and these stereotypes. For the longest time, you had bitter relations between your local city government and tribes. And most of the non-Indians in the area around reservations typically just viewed the reservation as being this glorified social service program. They had no idea that the U.S. Constitution specifically describes dealings with tribes. And it just never clicked until the tribes are now engaging in economic development, through their own innovation. And it's a really exciting times because you can just see it. I mean, I can see it locally as well as nationally.
Being a tribal member, I think it's the same obstacle I was up against when I walked into the bank, and a woman, a single woman, and also it was on my application that yes, I do have Native American background. So I think that the combination was a stumbling point for me. This unit that you see here, this wire is actually 65 feet long, and it fits on a rail car. And this is a very exciting program for us because as a woman-owned minority company, I am the only one in the U.S. that manufactured the first unit. It's a great feeling to know that I have stuck with my plan and my goal and my dream, and I have this business, and I'd love to share it. My future goal is to go out on one of the reservations and set up an electronic assembly house, train people. So I'm hoping in the next 2 years to set that in place.
My passion is cooking, and that started at an earlier age when my dad, being a construction worker in Chicago, used to work with a lot of black co-workers, and they always used to disappear during the lunch hour, but when they came back, they had some of the most incredible hickory smoked spare ribs. And so really from an early age, I've had this mission of life to make the best barbecue in America. I tell you, being able to raise money when you're starting out is a difficult thing, and having parents that were not business people. Indian people are really a first generation of business owners, and I didn't have anybody who could mentor me. There wasn't like an Indian bank that I could go, and actually my first bank loan was nothing more than just flat out hard work. For months I pounded the pavement in the city of Chicago. I went from bank to bank, day after day. One of them saw that dream. One of them saw my passion and believed in me. As a matter of fact, my first bank loan was for $10,000 when I was 19 years old, and it was unsecured, and it was given to me on my name alone. We've gone from 30 employees to over 3,000. One of my goals is being sensitive towards hiring minorities, and wherever I can, I try to give that back to the community. My restaurant in Hayward, Wisconsin, we have many of our tribal members from LCO that work here. In spite of all of the failures, in spite of all of the problems that I've had in life, because I never gave up on my dreams, some pretty incredible things have happened.
You know, what I see is that 75% of the people hunt, 50% of the people harvest wild rice. A good portion of them have been in maple sugar bush, a lot pick medicinal plants. And like maybe my cousin picks plants and other people don't, but she may help 40 people or 40 families. So what I see is that Anishinaabe way, you know, our way keeps going. But it is not in your economic statistics. It's not in your Department of Labor studies. You know, our practice of traditional harvesting and sharing. These things do not appear, but they continue.
I think one of the most remarkable things of Ojibwe history is the resiliency of the Ojibwe people. Remember that their culture, their language, their traditions, their rights, their treaty rights, have been assaulted time and again, whether it was by the French, the English, the United States, but generations and generations of missionaries, of government officials, of traders have led an assault on their language, their customs, their way of life. To me, the remarkable thing is the tremendous resiliency of this people, the continued attachment to their land, the continued attachment to hunting, to fishing and gathering in the regions near their reservations, their homelands.
That which is given to us must be understood as the Anishinaabe views it, that this is a reciprocation, that we return back something for that which was given to us.
We put on the east side of the tree because that's where the sun rises and where our new day begins.
Those ceremonies have to continue because those ceremonies reflect our connectedness with all of creation.
Easy does it. You feel it now, you can hear it crack out. Okay, easy there.
What I pray is that as tribal governments and those who have much influence and power, which is the reality, as they look ahead, they will seek to strengthen and recover that which we are, because that will be our strength.
Taking this tree skin, so we got to be careful because we don't want to hurt the inside. Pull it really easy. Okay, that's it. Take your time.
And if we lose this connection, we're not going to survive as the Anishinaabe people.
It's just perfect.
Then that is how we sustain into the future.
Ojibwe moa, well, well.